Hello, everybody. My name is Kathleen Kendall Tackett, and I'm coming from Preclaris Press, and we are interviewing Dr. William Parker from the Duke University School of Medicine. Dr. Parker is an immunologist, and he's just recently published a very interesting paper looking at the link between acetaminophen and it increasing the risk of autism. And so I got him to agree to come on and talk to us a little bit about that research and what he's found and what is, I think, some very concerning research and what do parents need to do about this. And so, first of all, welcome, Dr. Parker. I'm happy to have you here. Thanks for agreeing to talk to me today. But what we'd like to do is actually first ask you a little bit about the paper that you recently published that examined that sort of link. And you were saying that earlier, a causal link between using acetaminophen, especially in infancy and early childhood, and it actually increasing the risk of autism. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you found and a little bit about kind of how you did the studies and what do you consider sort of the lines of research that demonstrate this sort of link.
Thank you. Yes, so that paper is what we call a critical review. So we had a group of professors, some from Duke, a couple from Harvard, and Cindy Nevison helped us with the epidemiology. She's at Colorado. We had a couple of interns working on it. It took us about 8 months really to try to compile as much information as we could, some circumstantial, some less circumstantial and more direct about the connection between acetaminophen or paracetamol. It's called paracetamol in Europe. It's the same thing as acetaminophen. Exposure to that and the development of autism. So we just published it, I guess, in March of this year, after months of research, trying to pull together whatever information we could find, whether it was for the idea that acetaminophen is associated with autism or against the idea. And even since that paper was published in March, there's been a couple of more recent papers that have come out addressing the same issue. So, and what we found was there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that's very compelling circumstantial evidence that suggests much of the autism that we have today is induced by or caused by acetaminophen exposure, particularly between birth. So from the time the mother's umbilical cord, the connection with the baby is cut, the umbilical cord is cut until maybe age 5 or 6. So that's the most concerning. The most data, though, probably relate to the effects of acetaminophen exposure during pregnancy. So there's a sort of a separation. We're more confident about the effects during pregnancy. And a very, very recent paper came out and showed that acetaminophen exposure for treating fevers during pregnancy is probably not dangerous, at least just in terms of looking at the development of autism. But there's been a dozen studies, literally 12 studies now that have come out, and 11 of those are looking at the effects of acetaminophen exposure during pregnancy in humans, and they all find some kind of developmental problems. So in the critical review, we don't just look at those studies in humans. We're also looking at what all other evidence is available. Does the epidemiology, for example, match up? And what we find is that what we know as the epidemic of autism started around 1980. Before that, probably the rate was about 1 case in 2,500, which is considered fairly rare. Yeah. And now it's in more than 1 in 100. So it's gone up by more than 20-fold. So we're looking for some kind of environmental cause. And I know there's some debate about that. And again, we have an epidemiologist we work with, and we deal with that a lot in the publication and when I give lectures about this idea that there is no epidemic versus what we think is truly an epidemic that's induced by a very specific agent. So it turns out that in 1980 is when the use of aspirin was associated with Reye syndrome. So the use of aspirin fell off rapidly and acetaminophen rapidly took its place.
So you had actually mentioned earlier about that certain children are more at risk for this effect. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Right. So if you look at the risk factors for autism, there's one glaring thing that keeps popping up, and that's something we call oxidative stress. So oxidative stress is what happens when the immune system gets overwhelmed. You get a buildup of toxins. Our bodies are essentially biochemical furnaces, and inflammation is when we turn up the heat on that furnace to try to attack something that our body believes is invading us. And when the furnace starts getting overheated and can't keep up with things, you can call that oxidative stress. And it looks like a variety of conditions, with one notable exception, which is, again, another clue about what's really going on. But a variety of conditions, especially problems with vitamin B metabolism, affect the metabolism of acetaminophen, and they also have an association with increased risk for autism. And the exception to that is cystic fibrosis. It is associated with oxidative stress. But those individuals, number one, as far as we can tell, they're not at risk for autism, based on what we can find in the literature and from interviewing physicians who treat a lot of patients with cystic fibrosis. And number two, they are very efficient metabolizers, much better than normal people at metabolizing acetaminophen.
That's interesting.
That's just, when we add it all up, there's essentially 12 independent lines of evidence. Some of it have to do with, say, the rates of autism in Israel and in South Korea and possibly in Cuba, and how there's no explanation for certain anomalies, in the very substantial anomalies in the epidemiology, except that, the business of the acetaminophen exposure does add, and there's a connection with circumcision in autism, which we believe is because, and vaccines in autism in the minds of many parents, we believe that's because acetaminophen was used at the time of vaccination for a large number of children. Now,
you also mentioned that boys actually seem to be more vulnerable to these effects. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Right. It's another clue. So it turns out that Margaret McCarthy at the University of Maryland, she's a chair there of that department, is probably the leading expert on the difference between the male and the female brain. That to me is a matter of mystery, and I don't want to study that. But Margaret has tackled that problem, and she's also looked at drugs. She's looked a little bit at acetaminophen and a number of drugs that act the same way that acetaminophen does, and I believe she has an excellent grasp on what's going on there. It has to do with the prostaglandin E2 and how important that is for the development of the male brain, and not as much so for the female brain. And it turns out that the prostaglandin, the synthesis of that is blocked by acetaminophen. It blocks an enzyme. It blocks the enzyme which is responsible for producing prostaglandin. And then,
I was going to say, it's very interesting just because, when you look at, the rates of autism and autism spectrum disorders, I mean, it's 5 to 1, 6 to 1, 10 to 1, depending on the disorder. And so it's actually very, very interesting that there does seem to be this vulnerability, and that there could be this environmental factor that then accentuates that vulnerability.
Right. And, one of the strongest lines of evidence, other than those dozen studies in humans that have been published, is just when people have recently gotten around to looking at, well, what does acetaminophen do to the brain development in laboratory animals? And it turns out it is very dangerous. So if acetaminophen was a modern drug, it would have gone through testing and it would have never been used. But it literally comes back from, the 1800s. So it just was grandfathered in. As soon as aspirin was associated with Reye's syndrome, they just picked up the next drug, which is approved, not realizing that it had literally never been tested, even in laboratory animals, for safety for brain development. And this is despite the fact that the mechanism of action of that drug, the known mechanism of action, is to shut down the function of part of the brain, the hypothalamus, which produces fevers.
Well, so given what you're sharing, what would be your recommendation for parents?
Well, of course, we can't, we're not medical professionals treating our patient. So that there's no specific recommendation other than to be informed, talk to the pediatrician, be aware of the information out there. And we're doing our best to get the information out. And we can see, one of the big problems now is there's so much misinformation. The 10th study, this is the 10th study that came out simultaneously with two other studies showing, problems with neural development, with early exposure to acetaminophen, and it just got hammered by the National Health Service of the UK and, prominent websites by people who didn't understand the study, first of all, and secondly, they apparently were unaware that this is the 10th study to come along. So there's just a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. I think I mentioned it took us 8 months to really put all the information together.
Right.
And people are literally within 2 or 3 days, they'll write a critique of the latest study and they'll publish it. And just creating, again, misinformation. If you go back and actually read all of those studies, every single one of them is extremely concerning. They've thought of the obvious things. Was it the acetaminophen or was it the reason they took the acetaminophen?
Right.
I mean, that's what everybody thinks of. And so
Right.
they look at that. The very first study in 2008, it looked at that. Although of all the 13 studies that have been published, 8 of those are just within the last 2 years. So there has been information available since 2008, but most of the information that we have is very, very recent.
Yeah, it sounded like, from all those different studies that you cited, I mean, many of them were just within the last 2 years.
Yes.
Well, so given what what would you like to see done at a policy level?
Well, the first thing I think that we need to do is put some warnings on the packages. I mean, the problem right now is that I can go into a local toy store here, literally 2 miles down the road, and I can find 3 different flavors of acetaminophen for tiny little babies. So I think, and there's no indication on that packaging that there could be any problems with it.
Right.
So I think, and we know that either in the clinic or at home, 15% of all doses of acetaminophen are actually overdoses.
Right.
It's not being used carefully. So I think one is to just make people aware, change the packaging, say, hey, look, if you're going to use this, it's a decision, but you need to be aware. This is, if your baby is, parents are literally giving it out because their children have colds, and it's not even intended to treat a cold, and it's not, even the pharmaceutical industry doesn't recommend to use the drug to treat a cold. So I think making people aware is the first thing. And then, of course, we need to extremely quickly focus, and we've talked about this, the experiment, it will take a little bit of time, but we need to carefully assess how much autism is potentially being induced by exposure to acetaminophen. I think especially from birth to age 5 or 6.
Right. And I mean, that, of course, is, when the brain is the most vulnerable.
Well, and one of the problems is we've been thinking the brain is the most vulnerable during pregnancy, the brain of the fetus, but it looks like the mother's liver, I mean, our working hypothesis is that the mother's liver is very protective at that point, and it's, as soon as that separation occurs when the umbilical cord is cut, the biochemistry changes, and that's when the baby's brain becomes much, much more at risk, although it's still at risk during pregnancy.
Right.
A dozen studies are showing that.
Well, and like I said, many of the studies that look at kind of like the vulnerability of the brain really are actually looking at that first 5 years after birth. So it's like, yeah, there is definitely, because we look at it from the trauma standpoint, and again, like I said, that sort of vulnerability of the brain. So, this is another environmental insult, unfortunately. So you had actually talked a little bit earlier today about a website where parents could go to get information about other ways to kind of help their babies be more comfortable, like if they're fussy or if they have a fever. Could you share that?
Yes. So the web link for that, we can look up from the slides that I've given you. It's produced by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and basically it's looking at how to treat a fever without using pharmaceuticals. So
I think the website was healthychildren.org.
Okay.
Yes, and so it's like, then there's a link in there for treating for not, because again, like I said, I think that's one of the things that sort of drives acetaminophen use is oftentimes babies are fussy, they're teething, or they, as you said, they're reacting to vaccination, or they just kind of are out of sorts. And I think that is a lot of when parents use Tylenol thinking it's benign.
Right.
evidence is kind of showing that it isn't.
Yeah, and you made the point earlier in our discussion that, you know, the goals of everybody, the pediatrician, the parent, they're all very good goals. We want to make the baby comfortable.
Right.
And we've sort of gotten, I think, so accustomed to pharmaceuticals that we're willing to make a baby comfortable using a drug that targets the developing brain in very profound ways. The studies in laboratory animals are just incredible on how much brain, and you know, an independent line of evidence, which we haven't mentioned yet, is that the acetaminophen actually has similar effects on adults, although they're temporary. It lowers social awareness, it lowers IQ, and these are, you know, just some side effects, and it also causes inflammation in healthy adults. So there's a lot of things going on with acetaminophen, and just because of our comfort level with pharmaceuticals, we're not thinking about the potential hazards, I think.
Well, I think everybody's had this idea that this has been around forever and it's really safe.
Right. And in reality, it's really only been used extensively in children starting since about 1980. So it's, but that being said, your practicing physician today, for their practicing life, for their career, they've been using it. They've been awash in it, and they've been prescribing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be something that's going to take us a while to sort of change the culture, but it's really good to get the information out there.
Yeah, and you know, there's very prominent physicians who are quoted online as saying, yeah, it's perfectly safe. And, you know, I've contacted all of them I could find and say, hey, are you aware of this information? And not one of them has stood by their statements. What happened, and I talked to them, basically, somebody asked them, hey, is this safe? And they didn't ask them, you know, did you review the literature? You know, did you spend 8 months reviewing the literature? They just said, hey, is this safe? And they said, oh, yeah, sure, I do it every day. And then they get quoted, you know, and you know, once they realize, you know, what the literature is, then they feel horrible about it because they're quoted as in a very prominent way on the web as saying it's perfectly safe, when in reality, one physician told me, look, I was interviewed as a clinician, not as somebody who you know, they asked me, what is my current practice, basically. So there's,
and you know, it's like, I think that's one of the challenges that clinicians often face is keeping up with, you know, huge amounts of literature. I think it's a very, very, very difficult task. And so something, especially something that's been grandfathered in, you think, oh yeah, I've been using this forever, and you know, I haven't seen any bad effects. Well, you know, again, they may not be necessarily looking at it the same way, you know, an epidemiologist would, you know, in terms of these effects. So again, like I said, I think the fact that, you know, so many of those clinicians have come back and said, wait, you know, maybe let's rethink this. I think that's a good sign that they were willing to actually consider new evidence. Because I mean, that is the nature of medical evidence, isn't it? You know, is that it changes and it evolves, and things that we used to think were true are no longer true.
Yeah.
It's kind of like you had said, you know, the scientists don't necessarily like the word truth because it tends to change as we learn more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, it's people when they learn this information, they get mad at their pediatrician, but you know, there's millions of papers published every year. The pediatrician's job is really to just perform standard of care. It's not to know every single one of those million papers. And, you know, in our review that we published earlier, we went through those millions and millions and millions of papers and ended up with about 150 or so that really we think have a bearing. And we tried very hard not to cherry pick, you know, not to try to pick certain papers that favored one hypothesis. We tried to sort of weigh, is this strong evidence? So, for example, there's numerous papers published showing a plausible mechanism by which acetaminophen might induce autism. So we weigh that as weak evidence, but sort of necessary evidence. So if it makes sense, which it does, it makes sense, then that's good. That supports the hypothesis, but it's not strong evidence. So if it didn't make any sense, we wouldn't favor this hypothesis, but in fact it does.
Well, and as you said, you see different lines of evidence all kind of coming to the same place, you know, and that a lot of times is, I think, an indication that there is an association.
Yeah, and in this case, more than an association, it looks like it's causal. You know, like I said, especially in the laboratory animals,
Right.
you can strictly rule out associations because
Right.
there's no placebo effects,
Right.
there's no indication effects, there's, those are extremely potent. And for the circumcision data in humans too, the only plausible explanation we have is the acetaminophen exposure. There's no
other
circumcision
difference
by itself. And there's data from Israel in different groups, traditional circumcision without acetaminophen versus, in the hospital. Again, you're looking at a lot of information where the only plausible explanation we have is the acetaminophen exposure.
Right.
So it's on the one hand, it's oh my gosh, this is so common.
Right.
It sounds like a conspiracy theory. But on the other hand, it just makes so much sense. And, when we have a number, I think there were 5 faculty members on our paper, and we put our heads together, and it just made sense to all of us, as well as other people that we've talked with.
Well, and you said you had a variety of disciplines, represented in that paper as well. And I think actually that gives strength to your argument. Because,
right.
You wouldn't want, say, like an epidemiologist coming along and saying, well, wait, no, that's not quite, because you had an epidemiologist and you had all these people sort of lined up and, in the disciplines. So
right.
Now it's like, where can people get your paper? They want to read it.
Let's see, it's freely available online. It's the Journal of International Medical Research. If they just search for my name and acetaminophen and autism, it'll plop right up. It's out in the March issue. It's freely available. They can print it out. They can copy it. They can email it. There's no copyright restrictions on that.
Well, I want to just thank you for taking a minute to talk to us today, William, and I really appreciate it. And I hope we can help get your information out there.
Thanks very much, Kathy. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you.